When I was younger, my mother would leave me home with my older brothers. As soon as she would leave the house, they would pull out a hidden Ouija board and play around with it. Of course, I wasn't allowed to be part of the game. I was around 6 or 7 and they were in their late teens. I can so vividly remember those memories. Mother would leave and the boys went into the bedroom off the kitchen where the board was hidden. They would then close the door behind them, and I was left watching cartoons by myself in the living room. The bedroom door had a gap under it though, about 1.5 inches, and I would sometimes quietly lay on the floor and watch them play through the gap. I can remember them making contact with the spirit one night, and then they asked it its name, to which it replied, Tobias. Each time they played after that, it always seemed to be Tobias reaching out. For about a week, they conversed with the spirit, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to come of it. However, one night, as I was watching them play, the board started talking about me. My brothers would always write down the things being communicated and read them out loud, which made it easier for me to eavesdrop on them. As I lay there on the kitchen floor, looking under the door, the game became more active, and my brother started writing. I then saw both of them make eye contact and looked at each other, confused. My older brother looked around and said, "It says we're being watched." As they looked around the room, I snuck back to the couch to watch my cartoons. They opened the door and then checked on me, and then went back to the room. I crept back over and continued watching them. This time, the board addressed me using my name. I recall my brother saying, "It says that Billy needs to go away." I could feel the blood leave my face. I knew my brothers hadn't seen me watching. I then got up and pretended to be sleeping on the couch, and eventually I just fell asleep there. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a strange sound, kind of like the sound a cat makes in its throat when it's mad. I then sat up and wiped the sleep from my eyes. I sat there in the dark for a moment, and it seemed so quiet in the house. I was about to get up and go to the bathroom, but then I felt like I couldn't stand up, almost like something was pushing down my shoulders. Suddenly, it was like I was in a wind tunnel. I remember the curtains were whirling around, and it felt like they filled the entire room. I felt so dizzy, and then it just stopped. I don't remember going to sleep at all, but I woke up on the same couch and it was finally daylight. I never spoke about this to anyone, but the story doesn't end there. My brothers continued to mess around with the board, to which I was no longer wanting to be around. It got to the point that weird things were happening to them too. They would talk about it amongst themselves, and I would play oblivious to it all. One night, my brothers walked out of the bedroom with a rolled-up sheet and scissors. They told me they would be right back and then walked out the door. I later learned the next morning that the board had said something that really frightened them. They took it down the road to the old iron bridge near the house to cut it up and throw it over. We were all sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast when we suddenly heard the sound of a loud crash outside. We ran out the door to see that a car had nearly driven off the bridge. My brothers were sure that it was because of the Ouija board, which they thought they had disposed of the night before. The person who wrecked the car happened to be a person my brother went to school with. He then told my brother that he had gotten in the crash because, when he was driving over the bridge, a demon-like figure appeared next to him in the car. He later found a piece of the board in his car, and nobody knows how it got there. This all happened to me between the ages of 2 and 9 years old. I lived in a huge apartment, about twice the size of the actual house I live in, maybe even a bit bigger. It had a fireplace that we never used in the living room. It had a living room, a kitchen, a big bedroom, a hallway, a small bedroom, bathroom, and inside the big bedroom was a tiny closet that led to a pretty big boiler room inside the walls. We usually used it for storage of holiday decorations and stuff. For some reason, I was deathly afraid of sleeping in my own room, which I was totally fine with playing in during the morning, so I ended up always sleeping in my dad's bed. His bed was much larger and definitely more comfortable. I slept in his bed till I was around 7 years old, to which I still refused to sleep in my room, so I then settled for the living room couch at the time. But before that all happened, when I was about 5 or so, it was super common for me to sleepwalk or sleep talk. It was a nightly occurrence, and my dad didn't think it was weird at all. He didn't even think it was weird when I would say stuff like, "Dad, I want you to meet my new friends." I would also sleepwalk in and out of the room constantly. I never even remembered saying any of this stuff, but he would casually tell me about it the next day, and it felt really weird to me, but I couldn't figure out why. I've always been the last person to go to sleep, no matter what age I was. I would always have this reoccurring nightmare. Now, I don't think I was asleep, but I didn't know anything about spirits or anything like that, and in the nightmare, I would be laying with my dad. He would be asleep, and there would be a shadow in the corner of the room, standing by the boiler room door. It definitely wasn't a reflection of anything in the room, because there wasn't much in there to begin with. Just a bed, dresser, and a computer desk and chair. Nothing in there could make a shape of a human-looking shadow. I would try to not move, and hoped that, if it attacks me, my dad would wake up. One night, I didn't fall asleep, and I'm sure of it to this day, that I was hearing a person in the living room, even though we lived alone and my dad was asleep next to me, snoring as usual. So, I went to investigate, and by the fireplace, there was a transparent figure of a chubby man with a mustache. He was yelling, but not in English. At this time, I thought it was Spanish because I didn't know about any other languages existing at the time. But now that I think of it, it was probably Latin. The same chubby man cornered me and started yelling in my face. I began to cry and duck under the coffee table in hopes that he couldn't lift it. Then the room went silent for like 2 minutes. I'm still too scared to come up because I think that he's still there. Then the coffee table starts lifting up. I then realized that it's my dad, and that the spirit was gone. He told me I was having a nightmare, probably sleepwalking, but I've never even heard of a ghost before, and I've never heard another language. I knew I wasn't asleep, and tried to defend myself, but he saw absolutely nothing weird the whole time, and shrugged it off. When I was around 12 or about 13 years old, I was staying at my dad's for the weekend. We watched movies and ate junk food, a usual occurrence when I got to see him. My brother was usually with us, but he was staying with a friend that night. He then decides it was time to go to bed. I went about my usual routine, getting ready for bed, laid down, and tried to get some sleep. I couldn't sleep this night for some reason. I just had a general feeling of uneasiness. My bed used to be vertical to the door, with my feet closest to the door. When I was a kid, I always used to sleep with my door open. I guess it gave me some sort of comfort, being able to see half of the entrance to my dad's door, knowing that he wasn't too far away from me. Anyways, as I said, I had a really hard time trying to fall asleep. Frustrated, I lay there, staring at my ceiling for a moment, and felt as if someone was watching me. I shifted my eyes to the doorway, and a pitch-black figure was standing in my doorway. Its head was almost touching the top of the frame. I've never had an issue with sleep paralysis, and have never had it since then. But in this moment, I couldn't move. All I could do was look, as this tall figure stood there, staring at me. Tears began to flow down my cheeks, and my heart felt as if it was about to burst from my chest. I managed to barely whisper, "Dad," and it turned its head sideways at me, as if it was confused. I began hyperventilating intensely, which must have woken up my dad, because he came running into my room, and as he came through the door, the figure quickly dissolved, as if a breeze came by and it went away with it. My dad held me in his arms as I cried. I slept in his room that night, and for the rest of my stay there, till I went back to my mom's. This event shook me to my core, and to this day, I cannot and will not sleep with an open door. I still have a deep feeling of fear and almost want to cry when I picture that thing and remember that night. Over the course of a few days, I've come to remember a number of pretty weird happenings around my old childhood home. I've been able to confirm some with my parents, but my siblings either claim to not remember, or they believe that the events may have been pranks set up by my younger siblings. Sometimes, they'd say that nothing strange ever happened in that house. It would probably be wise to explain a little bit about this house. This all happened in the early 90s. My parents had moved to a new city, all while my mother was pregnant with my younger brother. When shown the home, my parents took note that nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but also that the showing was rather brief. In need of a quick living arrangement, they decided to rent the house, move in, and to their dismay, found the basement filled to the brim with markings all over the walls and floorboards. The walls had spray-painted Nazi symbolism, coupled with what my father describes as odd circles, but my mother confirms as witches' circles, or demonic markings, some burned into the wood. My mother later confirmed a few Ouija boards were etched to the walls as well. They complained, and instead of moving, they had the entire basement cleaned, repainted, and continued to stay for the duration of my childhood. The first occurrences happened when I was between the ages 5 and 9 years old, continuing for the entire 4 years. Roughly, every night, I would refuse to go upstairs under any circumstance. I would physically refuse, and fight my mother or father, often throwing a huge fit when they attempted to physically move me upstairs. When finally asked why I was so vehemently refusing to go upstairs, I outright told my parents, "The girl in the white dress at the top of the stairs says it's not safe yet." The funny thing is, I remember the little girl, up until recently. I can't remember her face, but I remember she was about 7 and would tell me not to come upstairs because it wasn't safe. She wouldn't outright speak, but she'd convey the message while shaking her head. I remember that because it scared me the most when I was a kid. She would look in the direction of my room for a little bit, every so often. Then she'd simply look at me and disappear. That was when I knew it was safe to go upstairs. When I reached the age of 10, this stopped happening altogether. I never saw the girl again, but different, stranger things began to happen. You see, someone was murdered in our backyard, moments before my father came home one night. Fortunately that night, he decided to come through the front door, instead of entering the house through the back. Later the next day, odd meat was thrown into our backyard, and I found out about it when we noticed our dog smelling it. My dad brought him in, and the police restricted all access to our backyard for the remainder of the year. We later found out that the victim was shredded to death. We always assumed that was the meat. Of course, this likely made things worse, as a lot of the blood from that meat was on our property and took a while to clear out. Within the same year, my brother and I had a small area set up for us in the basement to play. Every time we'd go down there, we would hear a faint, yet strange whistling sound. This whistling was very similar to a human whistling a tune while doing busy work, but was eerie and very unsettling. For the entire year, my brother and I were trying to find the source of this whistle, and when we found it, we were terrified. I remember that day very well. I was turning 11 soon, and we followed the sound to behind the furnace. There, we found a shadow, similar to a human shadow, cast upon the wall. It was tall, it had a hat, no features, just like a normal shadow. It confused us, because we didn't understand how a shadow was there, because there was no light behind the furnace. It was dark, but the shadow was somehow darker. Then it looked at us. I use quotes because, physically, it couldn't look at us, but we just knew. We knew it was looking at us. Then it whistled. I'll never forget that tune. I'm not sure if anyone knows the tune, but it was the tune used for yodeling. Needless to say, we ran upstairs to our mom, terrified. She came to check it out, despite us telling her not to, and found nothing. We didn't play in the basement for a week after that, but every so often, we would hear the whistling during the week. And despite us asking our parents if they heard it, they never did. We eventually went back into the basement to play, at the insistence of our parents, and everything was okay for a little bit. But eventually, the shadow came back. It would always get our attention with the same tune, always trying to convince us to come and touch it, to see it. Neither of us would ever approach it, and we soon after realized it was stuck to the walls, literally. It couldn't go up the stairs, and could only travel along the walls, except for the stairway wall. As long as we remained away from the walls, the shadow man couldn't get to us, and it eventually resorted to yelling, before eventually leaving forever. After I turned 12, it never appeared again. However, strange things continued to occur in the basement. It was the summer of my 12th year. My brother and I had my cousins over, and were playing as my parents and other family members were cleaning up after a barbecue. As we played, the furnace began to glow a bright red on the filter door, as if it was being heated by a torch. It had started from the center of the door, and grew to encompass the entire door, before receding and leaving a bluish-green stain behind. Needless to say, we were all confused. My cousin, who often spent time with his contractor dad, insisted that we take the filter door off and check if it caught fire. We tried to tell him about the weird stuff in the basement, but he didn't believe it, and was convinced the filter burned. Upon taking the door off and inspecting the door, it was pristine on the inside, in its entirety. The door was still the standard silver, without any indication of burning, and the filter was its standard whitish gray, clean and new as it was replaced not too long ago. He took the filter off, and there was just a vent. Below that, a sizable amount of space, and a space to reach the pilot light hatch for the furnace. He put everything back, confused. We got our parents, and his dad checked everything out, other than the door exterior, The furnace was in perfect shape. After this incident, nobody would go in the basement again for a while, unless to put something in storage. That was until I turned 16 and insisted upon no longer sharing a room with my brother. I'd forgotten the past, setting aside my childish fears, and decided to move into the basement. Things start to get a lot more terrifying when you sleep in an unfurnished basement at night. I had consistent nightmares and weird sightings to the point where I often slept at my friends' houses to simply avoid sleeping in that basement. But I will share the most terrifying experience that I ever had, as my friends ceased to ever stay at my house and insisted upon staying at theirs. Due to often staying at my friends' houses, their parents began to get a little frustrated that I would never invite them over to my own home to stay the night. I often insisted against it, but eventually relented, as the perfect opportunity came up when my friend's parents went away for a week, and he was left to stay at my place for the duration. Needless to say, he was delighted, but I was extremely worried. To explain the basement a little, in order to gain some privacy, and as my family was not well off, we set up a wall using a bedsheet stapled to the beams of the basement ceiling. These sheets were, effectively, the walls of my room, with a small opening as an entrance. Everything was fine for most of the week, until roughly the 4th day. Around midnight, my friend couldn't get any sleep, and decided to try and get some shut-eye on the armchair in the corner of my room, which faced the bedsheet wall. As I was asleep, he awoke in a cold sweat and noticed the bedsheet ruffling a little bit. He noticed what seemed like a handprint on the other side of the sheet, pressing against it. Assuming it was my sister, who had a crush on him at the time, he jokingly asked the person on the other side to come around. On the 5th day, he got over it, assuming it was just a dream, and eventually, the night came upon us once more. Much like the night before, he woke up in a cold sweat that night. But this time, he awoke to find a girl in a white dress, about our age, standing at my bedside and just looking at me. He told me she wasn't scary, and her face wasn't messed up, but she looked sad. When she saw him, she simply looked at him, frowned, and walked towards the exit again, and he didn't dare move. The next morning, he told me that I was having nightmares as she stood over me. He didn't stay the rest of the week, and we moved a few months after that happened. My friend always insisted that I stay at his place until we moved. When he'd come over to visit, he would never go into the basement, not even to help me move my stuff. I dream about the house every so often. Weird, lucid dreams. I can never really go into the basement in these dreams, and sometimes I can't enter the house, but it always seems different. Ethereal. I will never know what happened down in that basement before we lived there, but there is something truly evil down there. I'm just glad we moved out before someone got hurt. I've shared this story with most of my friends, and none of them believe me. And that's fine. My scary story begins when I was around 10 years old. This happened in early June, which would be where my insomnia first started. I usually slept on my couch since I could never sleep in my bed. I fell asleep faster this night than any other. I typically don't go to bed until around 1 in the morning, but I fell asleep at around 11 p.m. this night. I began having a dream where I was walking down an empty, foggy street at night, only lit up by dim streetlights. I was walking along and saw a sweet older woman sitting in a rocking chair. Because I was very close with some of the older women in my family, I had a feeling of trust and immediately walked onto her porch. She looked up at me and smiled. I could not hear myself, but I believe I said hello because she responded to me, but I can't quite remember how she responded. But what I do remember was that she said, "Whatever you do, don't look at her. Do not look at the woman in the black dress." I stepped back, frightened. My eyes were then caught by a darkness. There was a streetlight unlit, and somebody was standing under it. Except something was off. I couldn't take my eyes off of them. It was a woman, standing at about 6 feet. She had black hair, and her skin was pale. It wasn't until only seconds I realized why she felt off. Her arms were longer than normal, her legs were lanky, and her knees were backwards. She was almost standing how a ballerina stands with their feet together, pointed outward. She had a black dress, torn apart at the bottom, and her face was horribly distorted. That's when it happened. She looked up at me, and suddenly, the street went dark. She then appeared from the shadows and grabbed me. I was then forced to awake, and there she was, right above me. I remembered what the old lady told me, and I closed my eyes tight. I could feel the woman pushing on my chest. I could feel her nails digging into me. I could hardly breathe. Only seconds had gone by, but it felt like minutes until I could open my eyes again. She was gone, and I began to cry. I ran upstairs, screaming for my parents. "The lady in the black dress got me! The lady in the black dress got me!" It freaked my dad right out, and my parents had to stay up with me all night. I didn't sleep for 5 days, until I finally passed out and slept for about 36 hours. Recently, my mother told me it was about 3:30 a.m. when I came screaming for them. It wasn't until lately that I found the courage to share this because I was so scared that she would return, but now that I'm older, I'm not afraid anymore. I've ruled it off as nothing more than sleep paralysis because it wasn't the first and last time I've had an experience like this. This one just felt a lot more real because I've never had anything be physical. It was usually just a figure in the corner or shadows melding and moving to play tricks on me. To this day, I think about that night and get a chill down my spine. Even though I'm writing this, I can almost feel her nails in my chest again. I haven't seen her since that night, but some nights, I fear she may return to finish me off. I've been a nurse for almost 5 years, and you can ask any nurse about this. Whether you're an ICU or rehabilitation nurse, for some reason, on every full moon, the hospital is in chaos. Some say it's the pull of the mystical lunar energy or whatever, but it's a known scientific fact that the moon has an effect on us. I'm sure you noticed this yourself. Perhaps you notice an increase of energy and can't fall asleep. And it's true. Many people are sleepless during the full moon, and it's one of the many reasons that they can be our busiest nights. On the night this story happened, I was relatively new and started as a rehab nurse. I had been warned by my peers that I better be ready for tonight as it was a full moon. I shrugged it off and told them that I wouldn't notice as every shift was a busy one for me. I soon learned what they meant. Many of the patients were restless or anxious, some even deciding to leave their rooms and walk around the floor. This became quite a hassle when we had to bring them all back to their rooms to give them medication and tell them that they needed to rest. I was pretty deep into my 12-hour shift, and as I finally got everyone settled, I was then told to go for a quick break. Nurses spend countless hours on their feet, so I jumped at the chance immediately. As I was walking down the hall to the break room, I noticed a senior patient at the other end of the hall, facing away from me. I then called out to him, but didn't get a response as he slowly turned the corner. This was more common with senior patients than you might think, so I decided to follow him and see where he was going. But as I turned the corner, I saw nothing. No one was there. I checked all the rooms in that hall, but he wasn't there. I don't know if it was because I was exhausted from running around that night, but perhaps I really did see a ghost of an old patient. I guess I'll never know. I live in a small town in a quiet neighborhood, and these stories are ones told to me by my mom that I either didn't witness or didn't remember, that seemed to follow my mom's family from house to house while she was a teen. First story. My mom was laying in her bed when she got that horrible feeling. Most of you have probably felt it before. The absolute feeling of dread, as if something evil is near you. She lay in her bed in the dark at around midnight while she was feeling this, when she sat up and started looking around. Suddenly, she felt a pressure on the bed, as if somebody sat on it, and at the same time, she saw an imprint from the pressure going to one point at the end of the bed, as if an invisible being had sat on the end of the bed. She screamed, and her mom came running in, my Nana. She decided to lay with her for the rest of the night, and claimed to feel the horrible feeling as well. My mom started sleeping with a Bible, and wasn't troubled again. My mom's bedroom was in the basement. Story 2. My mom was about 16, and her friend was spending the night at her house. They were both asleep when they both woke up screaming at the same time. They had no idea why. They were in her bedroom, in the basement. Years later, my dad was staying in the basement with a cousin who was visiting, and they both woke up at the same time screaming as well. They had no idea why. Story 3. My mom's 26 and I'm about 3 years old. She was spending the night at her parents' place to dog sit and decided to bring me. When we were in the basement, while she brushed her teeth in the bathroom, she said that 3-year-old me was talking to the door. She humored me and asked who I was talking to, and I responded, "The blue man." She humored me further and asked me again what I was talking about, and then I said, "He told me to call him Master." She picked me up and ran from the house screaming, leaving all of her belongings, which my dad retrieved the next day. Story 4. I was around 6 when this happened. I was playing games on my grandparents' computer in their basement by myself. That was the first time I ever felt that horrible feeling. The room in their basement, where the computer was my mom's old bedroom. I froze in place and didn't move for minutes, when I finally sprinted upstairs and asked if I could be taken home. That was how scared I got. Fast forward and I'm 13, which is a few years ago. Sometimes it still happens, but if I think about these stories even briefly, I will see a black shadow man staring at me around the corners, or even in the middle of a room, only to disappear a second later. I think whatever horror infected my grandparents' house latched onto me when I was 6, and I brought it back home with me. My only hope is, now that I've relived this all, I hope I don't get a visit tonight. Afterthought. My room is in the basement of my house.
Please leave your message